Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. It's nice to be with you all. Thanks very much to the team for arranging this. As I mentioned, I'm a research coordinator with Forensic Architecture. We're an investigative research agency. We're based at the University of London. And we use open source video and image evidence, that's image and video that's in the public domain, to investigate human rights violations by states and police and military. We're a highly collaborative and interdisciplinary organization. We work across disciplines such as journalism, architecture, activism, aesthetics, human rights, the law, sciences. And we work with groups of all sizes, from environmental activist groups and indigenous communities under threat to major international NGOs, media organizations such as the New York Times, the BBC, as well as with lawyers, international prosecutors and legal teams. I'm interested personally in how we can use open source research techniques and information that's in the public domain to investigate and expose human rights violations, but also what the use of those techniques and their possibilities can tell us about our information space and about the spaces of political and social discourse in which we have in the modern day to operate, both online and offline. So first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of FA's case history to give you an idea of some of what we've done and how we did it, and hopefully to demonstrate some new possibilities and to inspire you to think about creative research solutions and possibilities in your own fields and areas of interest and investigation. I'm also going to talk to you about some of the simple tools and techniques of open source research that FA uses. There are many more complicated tools that we use, including digital modeling, photogrammetry, other architectural practices, which take many years to train in. Many of the techniques at the heart of open source investigation are simple and accessible to all. And it's my hope that in sharing some of these techniques and ideas with you, you'll be inspired to try them out for yourself and to add a new component to your own set of research skills. Now, because FA's work is primarily in visual investigations, and because political and social conditions these days are communicated more than ever through images and videos, we're also going to look at and discuss some of the basics of image analysis, how to read images and videos, how to interrogate them, and how to incorporate them into your investigative process. So we'll discuss some resources for effective Google and social media searching, simple geolocation and chronolocation, that's identifying when and where a photo was taken, and how to make videos easier to analyze. Nope, not yet. I will do shortly. Okay, so we're also going to think about some of the limits of open source reporting and what it leaves out. During that time, I'll share a number of links with you, but don't worry, I'll be sharing the slides with you, so you won't have to make a note of those links as we go. There are a lot more tools. Okay, thank you. I don't need to share my screen just yet. I will do in a moment. Thank you. Okay, so after that, we'll have some time for questions, and then we're going to try a live research example of our own. I'm going to give you a set of information, some images, a location, and some descriptions of that place. And you'll have around half an hour to study that material, to do some additional online research, and to answer some questions, and then we'll discuss. And then finally, I want to hear from you. We're going to break into groups. You're going to spend a few minutes sketching out some project ideas based on the topic area, based on some broad topic areas. And you're going to devise some research strategies incorporating some of what we've discussed. Okay. So. My screen there. Okay, so forensic architecture uses a broad range of techniques to investigate and present evidence of human rights violations. We use open source research, we use video analysis, spatial and architectural practices, digital modeling, interactive web platforms, documents and archival research, and scientific analysis. And we work with and on behalf of communities that are affected by state violence. And we produce evidence for legal forums, for human rights groups, activists and media, as well as for arts and cultural institutions. Now, forensic architecture exists because conflict, violence, and human rights violations have become heavily mediatized. There's more video and image evidence around than ever before, and they've also become furiously contested. Chemical weapons attacks in Syria, such as in the Damascus suburb of Douma, as you see here, are an important example of the kind of modern contention over video and image evidence that seems to define our online political and social discourse in many respects. As our understanding of conflict and human rights violations is increasingly created and communicated through digital media, the truth of what has occurred can begin to seem less clear, rather than more clear, which is perhaps counterintuitive. More evidence and more documentation has somehow made it not easier to understand the world, but rather quite the opposite, has made things appear more complex and unclear. So in part, forensic architecture is a set of technical and theoretical tools for unpacking those mediatized and contentious events, and for accessing the truth, which often exists behind and between the fragments of media that do exist. And that's what you can see here, some of the extracts from the software that we use to analyze video and image evidence. But as this overwhelming quantity of image and video material has begun to unravel some of the basic assumptions that we have about shared truth in society, and as concepts like fake news and post-truth force us to ask us to believe how we believe what we believe anyway, what FA also does is uses new forums, particularly cultural and artistic institutions, and indeed also new and outsider forums such as this Citizens Tribunal from 2018 in Germany, to propose a new model for collectively and collaboratively constructing truths and building coalitions around those truths and around the exercise of truth production. Now, what binds our collaborations together, therefore, is not only the facts of the case, but also the process of establishing the facts. So in essence, what I want to talk to you about today is forensic architecture's proposition for truth production in a post-truth world. We're facing a certain crisis at the moment. I think it's something like a crisis in which people are rejecting the idea that others can reach out into the world and bring back truths and facts for them. That task of creating and disseminating truth used to be performed by institutions such as government and media organizations. And we used to exist in a vertical relationship to that truth, which is to say that the truth was handed to us as the citizens in some respect. But the internet and the open source revolution has exploded the stability of that system. That has good sides and it has bad sides, certainly. But as those institutions which used to provide the truths for us, around which we could orient ourselves, have faltered, a certain breed of political actor, largely on the populist right, is encouraging the public to believe that truth and fact don't exist. Not only that, but the challenge facing activists and researchers and monitors and investigators across civil society is that those same bad actors want us to believe not only that the truth is inaccessible to us, but also that we should distrust people who claim to have truths to share. Instead, they want us to believe that we're floating adrift in a sea of information and misinformation, and that we can essentially believe what we like. The truth is only what we say it is, and how could you ever know any different? It's under this cover that the human rights violations of the 21st century are carried out and concealed. Could I have video number 2, please? Okay, so what we should be seeing here is a video which began with a tweet shared by the social media account of the Israeli army, the IDF. It shows a video of an airstrike against a building, which it says is a terrorist training facility. Now we're going to take a closer look at this video. You're going to see a series of small missile strikes, what the Israeli army calls warning strikes, and then you're going to see quite a large explosion as the building is destroyed. Now, I suppose we've already seen the video, is that right? Okay, great. Now, I don't know if anybody spotted anything unusual about the process of that video. If we could now see video 3, that would be. We're going to see the video again. We're going to see it in a sort of 4-part to look at each of these missile strikes in turn. Now, you might notice that there's something unusual going on with one of those video clips. Clearly, when we see them side by side, one video has an entirely different feel to the rest. Now, why is that? Now, the keen-eyed amongst you, am I still sharing the screen? Yes, I am, excuse me. Yes, please. Okay, great, thank you. So this is the four screen video, right? Okay, great. It's a very short video. So you'll see that one of the 4 videos that we just showed there has an entirely different feel to the rest. Now, those of you particularly keen-eyed may have noticed that the reason that one of those videos looks slightly different is that actually 2 of those videos are the same video of the same airstrike, and they've been one has been altered in some way in order to appear to be a different video. Now, why is that? Well, what we have here is we have 4 videos, we have 3 airstrikes, we have 2 videos of the same airstrike, and our research showed that one of those strikes actually resulted in the death of 2 Palestinian teenagers who were sat on top of this building at the time of the airstrike. Now, why I show you this example is because it's very revealing. The IDF the Israeli army has shared a video of it essentially committing human rights violations. It's attacked a building without warning and has killed 2 Palestinian children. But they've also edited the video. Now, why edit the video? Okay, so maybe they wanted to cover their tracks, but they've also given us a little bit of information there that they didn't need to give us, right? Why not just show 3 videos? So this video is a really good example of a very modern kind of deception. Remember, this is the social media account of a national army, and it's being used to lie to us. But that lie is interesting because it also, in using video material to share that lie, it also gives us an opportunity to challenge, to expose them, and to offer a counter-truth, to take these little grains and to reassemble them into a counter-narrative. This idea of a counter-narrative is really important because the notion of assembling a truth, building a truth, is really important at forensic architecture. What we think of as the truth is not a noun, not a sort of a set of facts that are enduring and unchangeable, but as a process. Truth for us is a process of verification. So truth comes into being between different perspectives as an ongoing practice in which the development of facts around the world and about the world is socialized. The development of facts becomes the product of a coalition. It's something that our director has called open verification. And in the document I have to share with you a further reading, you'll find an article on that subject. Now, forensic architecture calls itself a counter-forensics agency. Forensics is the practice of the state. It's something that's closed, it's inaccessible, it's cordoned off, and it proceeds from the investigation of a crime to identifying a suspect to prosecution and sentencing. Now, counter-forensics is precisely the opposite. Counter-forensics opens up the production of evidence. Its strength is in transparency and in integrating and working across different forms of knowledge, institutions, and disciplines. The internet is at the heart of this process. Investigators have remote access to information about human rights violations from around the world, and images carried over distances bring specialists from a range of disciplines right into the heart of zones of conflict and into disputes about what's occurred there. So what does this look like in practice? Oh, of course, sorry. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at what that means in practice, this process of collaboratively building truths and using community and collaborative efforts to construct arguments and construct evidence. So first, I want to take you to, in fact, we're going to remain in Israel for this first example. Okay, so here you have a scene from a night raid carried out by the Israeli military police against a Bedouin village in the northern Negev desert in Israel. Now I'd like video 4, please. Thank you. Okay, so what's happened here is, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, could you pause the video? Sorry, I need to explain a little bit more the context. Thank you, I'm sorry. So during this night raid, and this was in 2017, a local teacher was shot to death by the Israeli police. And at the same time, an Israeli policeman was run over, was injured, and later died from his injuries. Now, the government claimed that the teacher was to blame for this incident. The teacher was a well-known local man. He'd grown up in this village. They claimed that the teacher accelerated towards the police with his headlights off and that they had to shoot in self-defense. But we were contacted by friends and by allies on the ground, activists and community, and they said that something wasn't right here. So we took a look at the evidence. Okay, now, could you please play the video? Thank you. So the following day, the Israeli government released this video, which they claimed showed the victim driving towards the police that you'll see over on the right-hand side with his headlights off. They said, look, his headlights are off. He drove at us as if to kill us. And look here, he accelerates towards a group of policemen. According to the Israeli state, this implied intention to kill. Now, something's wrong with this statement. I wonder if anyone can guess what it is. Now, what we're looking at here is thermal imaging footage from a helicopter, and it's being used to argue that the headlights of this vehicle are switched off and that he accelerates towards the police intentionally. Now, at this range, of course, thermal imaging footage from a helicopter is not capable of showing us whether car headlights are on or off, since they would not emit more heat energy than their surroundings. So once again, it seems that what we have here is an example of the Israeli government using video evidence in a way which does not support the claims that they're making about that evidence. And this is something that we have to look out for very often. So I'm going to show you now, can I have the next video, please? Video 5. So we went back to our activist friends on the ground and we found journalists who were there at the scene. And they showed us these video clips. And we were able to synchronize this video with some further videos shot by activists on the ground, as well as news media. And we realized that they both caught the same detail. In the background of this film, we could see a car and its headlights were on. Could this be the victim's car? Well, here we had to use some of our architectural modeling techniques to move between the camera positions of the two videos involved. We can see these 4 figures, perhaps they've been highlighted by now, and we can use our model to move back and forth between the video footage. And what our model suggests is that these 2 pieces of footage on the ground have captured the same moment as the aerial imagery, essentially the moment at which the teacher was shot. So what we have here is a momentary coincidence between journalism and activism on one hand and state surveillance on another hand. The Israeli state, in monitoring this event, has actually captured the evidence of its own human rights violations and published it. But what's interesting is that may have gone unnoticed were it not for our ability to reach out to community activists and organizers on the ground, their ability to have filmed that already, and the architectural techniques and theories of open source evidence that allow us to connect those pieces of evidence together and turn them into something powerful. Now, still, the police said he accelerated towards us, and the footage seemed to support that claim. I'll take the next video, please, now, video 6. So we traveled to the village itself, again, with our contacts on the ground and with members of the victim's family and with members of the community that were assaulted that night. We traveled to the village itself, and we recreated the incident as precisely as possible to demonstrate that the geography of the location itself would have caused the acceleration that was seen in that video. Is the video playing now, please? Yes, the next video, please. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Whoa, excuse me. Maybe. It's a bit difficult that I can't see the videos. It should be the video from slide 12. I'm sorry. It should be video 4. I believe so. Oh, this is annoying. I'm sorry. Now, what we should see here, and I hope I can confirm this, is a split screen, which is showing us the path of the car that we recreated in real life with members of this community against the path of the car in the video. So what's really important about this example is that in this instance, the facts themselves could disprove the lies that were being offered by the Israeli state. The facts that could do that could disprove this, were written into the ground itself. The Israeli government had produced a piece of video evidence which was in itself fraudulent, which was fake news, to use the common parlance of our time. And in front of our eyes and under our feet was the evidence that could disprove that claim. But the way to access that evidence was through uniting remote technical expertise, architectural and digital modeling expertise, with on-the-ground experience and situated knowledge and lived experience of that environment. And to access that information, to make it evidentiary, we had to work in collaboration. We had to bridge that remote distance. We had to move from behind our computer screens. And we had to get into the field and engage with the victims of violence in the process of creating and constructing evidences and truth. Finally, what we did with that evidence was we took it to one of the most prestigious art galleries in London, the Tate Britain. And we displayed this work for a vast crowd. Hundreds of thousands of people came to see this work. And the reason that we took it to an art gallery is precisely because when the agents of the Israeli state, such as the police, are involved in the killing of a civilian, it's extremely difficult to pursue that case through the courts. And this is something that we see replicated everywhere. We're seeing now in the US around the Black Lives Matter protests that are ongoing. It's extremely difficult to prosecute police officers for any violence committed against a civilian. And that difficulty is really at the essence of counterforensics and the process of forensic architectures constructing truth and sharing them with the public. When forums of legal and political discourse are closed to us, when we're not able to access courtrooms, we take our material instead to cultural institutions, to galleries, and that provides us with a means to avoid and to circumvent the blockages that we found in the legal system. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. I'm going to take you on to one of our most famous recent cases, and this is the case of the killing of Mark Duggan. And then Mark Duggan was a civilian living in London. He was stopped by police on August the 4th, 2011. And his killing led to widespread rioting around the country. 8 years and a number of failed legal cases following his killing by police. We were commissioned by lawyers for his family to investigate his killing using new methods. Now, what you're seeing on the screen right now is a digital reconstruction of the moments before Mark Duggan in his green jacket was shot. It's been created by our architects in the open source modeling software Blender. Creating this reconstruction requires deriving the locations of police officers and victims, modeling their body positions and their movements. And we'll take a look at how we did that. But to outline the case, so Mark Duggan was stopped by police because they knew that he was carrying a gun in the back of this minicab. Mark Duggan was had some minor criminal convictions, but was not known to be a serious criminal. As his car was stopped, he leapt out of the car, potentially to escape, we'll never know, and he was quickly shot twice by the officer that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. That officer, who was known as V53, said that Duggan was carrying the gun in his hand at the time and shot him as such in self-defense. But the gun was later found here, 7 meters away from where he was shot. The officers involved said they didn't see him throw the gun, and the police investigation believed him. In fact, a police investigation concluded that Duggan had thrown the gun while he was being shot, even though no police officers had seen this happen, and even though their own pathologist said that this was practically impossible. We had two questions then. How did the gun get to the grass? And could the officers have missed the gun being thrown? This meant we had to understand as much as possible precisely where the officers were at the time of the shooting. We used publicly available material, which has been online available for over 5 years, to estimate their position and to interrogate the claims that they made. But again, what we had to do was not only innovate in how we investigate, but in how we present this information. The information itself had been online and available and reported on for a very long time. How can we convince the public to reconsider the facts of the case? How can we access and share this information in a new way? Okay, here I need, please, video. Just checking the right one. Here I need video 9, please. Thank you. So you should be seeing some live action on the screen here. We don't usually have this. But this is one of our team members, Tom, and he's filming the scene of the killing. So we went to the scene of the killing in North London. We took thousands of photos of the site according to a specific process. And using a program called, a software called photogrammetry, which is what you'll be seeing here, we can turn those hundreds of 2D images, all arranged in space, into a 3D model, which is a very precise reconstruction of the real world environment. We call this the site model. Into that, we place the minicab, the police cars using information from crime scene photographs. We call this the layer of the scene. And this became the backdrop for our investigation, of the incident. To understand more about where the officers then were arranged in that scene, we had to go deeper and we had to look at different sources of information. Now, an official investigation into Mark Duggan's death, which concluded in 2014, put thousands of pages of documents into the public domain. This is the material that I said for 5 years or so has been available to the public. Now, that information included witness statements, testimonies, plans, expert reports, and some of these documents gave us precise information about where certain parts of the incident had unfolded and where the officers had been. You can see, for example, that we know where the police cars and the minicab were parked from these photographs, and we were able to arrange them within a 3D model very precisely. But other accounts were more narrative, such as the witness statements given by police officers. So we had to think, how could we process all of this information? How could we turn these narratives, these accounts of the incident, which are full of memory gaps, they're full of contradictions, how could we make them into new forms of evidence? And could we find ways to explore and to expose possible moments of collusion between the officers, where they had agreed upon things that they should say in their statements, perhaps to cover something up or to bring out a different detail? So first, we took the written statements and the verbal testimony from the officers involved, and we analysed them as if they were as part of a spreadsheet. So we broke the incident down into 9 moments. Here you see the hard stop when the police cars stopped the minicab through to after the shots had been fired. And then we broke down each of the statements that we were given into a row. Each row is how one officer says he saw the whole event unfold from beginning to end. Each square within the database tells you what one officer thought about one particular narrative moment. And what each column tells you is how each of those officers viewed the same moment. And this made it relatively easy for us to begin to pull out contradictions, moments of synchronicity where the accounts agreed and where they didn't agree. So what we've done here is sort of atomized the statements, turned them into, as much as possible, broken down narrative descriptions. As we're aware, when people give testimony, it can often be very rambling and slightly unclear. We try to break that down and atomize it into precisely the details and the arrangements of facts that those accounts are offering. From there, our architects turned each of those cells, each of those moments, what one officer thought he saw at one particular moment, into a kind of spatial database. So we could see approximately where every officer was according to one another's statements, but also we could see what they thought they saw at that particular moment. Now, these were, of course, approximate at this stage, but we could slowly remodel and iteratively remodel the scene multiple times in order to arrive at what you might think of as upper and lower thresholds for certain actions. So we knew that one officer must have left his car before another officer because of what those officers said that they could have seen at that time, and where we knew that that meant they must have been positioned. So using this information, for example, we could narrow down exactly how far away the officers would have been from Mark Duggan when he was shot. So what would they have seen? Well, more information that was publicly available was the pathology reports that describe the condition of the victim's body at the time of death. Those reports gave us information about the entry and exit wounds of the two shots that were fired on Mark Duggan that were fatal to him. Now, those entry and exit wounds gave us precise information about how Duggan would have been positioned at each moment. What we could do is take lines, draw lines through the entry and exit wounds of each of these gunshots, and these gave us kind of positioning rods, right? These would act like positioning rods, which would give us a range of possible body positions to meet and to make sense of the line of fire of each of those shots. So all of a sudden, from pathology reports and from testimony, when we've applied spatial and open source thinking to the information that's there, we find that we have a great deal more access and information into these questions, these sort of perceptual questions, which might have seemed quite inaccessible initially. The questions of what would the officers have seen at the time of each shot. Now I need video number 10, please. So the pathologist who had conducted those reports, thank you, we also reached out to him for additional information that was not captured in his formal report. So when we put together the information from the officers' testimonies, from the pathology reports, from additional expertise that we've consulted on, we find that we have a very precise understanding of the victim's movements before he died. Each of these steps that you're seeing here is according to a range of expertise and draws together and extrapolates between different modes of information, from expertise to pathology to testimony and document analysis. So now we know approximately where the officers were in relation to the victim and how the victim moved. Next, since we knew that the distance that the gun had traveled 7 meters, and we knew the weight of the gun weighed around 1 kilogram, we were able to work out what the throw would have to look like. What does it look like when a human throws a 1 kilogram object 7 meters? So we worked with a biomechanics expert in the United States. We could work out the amount of energy required to throw the gun. You know, this is like high school physics, really, a 7-meter throw, a 1 kilometer object. The more complicated part is, what would that throw look like when it's done by an adult human? So what is that, like a small throw? Could you toss it from the side of your hand? Or is this a large throw that requires your whole arm? And of course, the answer to that question tells you something about whether about the extent to which the officers could have missed or seen that throw. So according to the biomechanics expert, this would have had to be a large sweeping motion with the hand. So what would that look like from the officer's perspective? Well, we know how far away the officers are from Duggan, approximately between 3 and 5 meters. We know Duggan's height. We know his approximate body position. We know the required throw. We also know the lighting conditions. It was a sunny August day. It was a bright day. So we can place a camera within our model at the location of the officer. And then we can play through multiple scenarios, different points at which Duggan could have thrown the gun. I'll take the next video now, please. I think that's video 11. So here first, you're seeing Mark Duggan moving and being shot as he exits without throwing a gun. So this is a sort of baseline possibility. Now we'll see perhaps Duggan threw the gun before he was shot. I should say these videos are slowed down for the purposes of presentation. In actual fact, we believe this process would have taken between 1.5 and 2 seconds from exiting the vehicle to being shot twice. There you see Mark Duggan throwing the gun between the shots. And finally, we see Mark Duggan throwing the gun after the second shot. Which has been at the heart of a really fundamental case in London's history, London's recent history anyway, which is to say, could the officer have missed the gun? Could he have missed the gun being thrown? Now, again, all of this information was either already in the world in the form of public documents, or it was already in the world in the form of essentially high school physics. Right? The weight of the gun has always been known. The location of the officers relative to Mark's position has, if not already been explicitly known, then it has been something that we can work out from the documents that we have and from our understanding of the environment and the distances involved. So there's a sense in which this information is both extremely new, as you're seeing it, and timeless. It's always been there. And I think this is something which comes up a great deal in forensic architecture's work. We are always revisiting information which is already in the public domain, but what's critical is the way that we think about reorganizing it, reinterpreting it, finding new ways to present it to ourselves and to a public, and thereby to newly investigate it and share those conclusions with the public. So while we can never enter into the perception of the officers involved, and of course this is a very fundamental question when you come to the questions of whether the police are allowed to exercise violence, always comes down to a question of what the officer perceived. If the officer perceived themselves to be in danger, then they are essentially given license by the state to act in a violent manner. And this is something which is irresolvable about the nature of the police as we understand it. So while we can never enter into the perception of the officers involved to definitely say whether they would or would not have seen a firearm if it was thrown, what we can do is show the problem from the officer's position, show the situation from the officer's position more clearly than ever before. And we can also invite other people, be that investigators, be that members of the police force or members of the public, to experience the scene themselves. So here what you're seeing is one of our researchers, in fact that's me, using virtual reality to explore this scene. So we turned our 3D model into a navigable 3D environment, a virtual reality environment, so that members of the public and ourselves could explore this scene from the position of multiple officers, from various free-floating positions nearby. And from there, we took this information, we took this presentation to an art gallery in London. It's going to be exhibited towards the end of this year at the Institute for Contemporary Art. But before we shared that material with the general public, before we launched our investigation, we actually took it to a local community event in Tottenham, about a mile from where the killing took place. And we showed our results first to a community that has many years of experience of police violence and killings, so that what began with open source evidence and remote expertise and technical expertise actually concluded in a presentation, was launched in a presentation alongside and hosted by members of and leaders of the communities that have been deeply affected by the issues that we are engaging with and exploring in our own technical and remote way. And it's those communities whose situated knowledge, whose deep understanding of the realities of police violence and racism within police forces is amplified and strengthened by the addition of remote technical expertise. What we want to do is use that expertise that we have to amplify and to lift the voices of people who already deeply understand the issues with which we're engaging. Okay, so I think now I'm going to come out of share screen. And I think now is a good time perhaps to launch into some question and answer before no, that's not true. I'm gonna show you a few. I'm gonna run through a couple of tools now, actually, I think, and then we'll have some questions after that. Come back into share screen. Okay, so what do we mean by open sources? First of all, open sources are images and videos most commonly, but also satellite images. In satellite images, we can read changes over time. What did something look like from the air in the past and today? We can look at things like satellite to ground image matching. And this is something that we'll try in our research exercise, understanding what things in ground level images look like from above. There are also some technical applications for satellite images, things like NDVI and remote sensing, which are things which I'm not going to go into right now, but things that I'd be very happy to help you to look up in your own time. In fact, the environmental group may be familiar with NDVI techniques already, and perhaps I'd be able to share some material about those with you later on. Now, open sources also involve documents, contracts and tendering documents. We live in a time where more and more documents are uploaded online than ever before. And in certain contexts, governments can be quite good about keeping track of the purchases they've made and the use that they've put certain purchases to. You can also find product catalogs, technical specifications. At the moment, we've been finding technical specifications for tear gas grenades that have been used in protests in Hong Kong, in Chile, and also in the US. And from those technical sort of chemical specifications, you can find out a lot about whether the use of tear gas in a certain context was violating human rights or not. You can also find locations, of course, related institutions and organizations, contact details, email addresses. But witnesses are also a very important open source, right? Interviewing, testimony, and crowdsourcing information, using social media to connect to other individuals, to find collaborators, and to bring them in and to bring in what they know is also a really vital use of open sources. So where do we get this material from? Okay, well, I'm going to run through a couple of thoughts about social media platforms for now. Now, these slides I will share with you all so that you can take a look through some of these links yourself, because I don't want to go into each of these things now. It'll take up quite a lot of our time. Twitter is a really effective social media search environment. Its search is one of the more sophisticated, and a great deal of information relating to protest and activism and political activism comes up on Twitter. And if you're not already using TweetDeck to focus and multiply your searches, then you really should be. Do check out TweetDeck. And Facebook, unfortunately, no longer seems to be as effective as a social media search resource. Some of the ways that it would allow you to search for information and search for geotagged information, geolocated information, used to be, frankly, quite invasive. It was very easy to find very detailed information about people who probably had no expectation that you would be looking for it. They have since clamped down on what they called graph searching. So the search function is very restricted now, but there are a couple of tools here that you can use to try and circumvent some of those problems, and occasionally you can still find information that's quite valuable. In fact, what we're going to look at in the live research exercise is some videos that have been taken, images that have been taken from Facebook, which turned out to be really critical to one of our cases. Instagram and TikTok can be really useful for certain conditions. We're seeing quite a lot of live streaming of protests on Instagram. We're also seeing that as activist and protest demographics become younger, TikTok is becoming a sort of an interesting new ground for open source and social media research. So there's a lot to explore there. And it's a really interesting time to get into exploring open source material on TikTok because it's brand new and we don't really know how this field is going to settle yet. Now, document archives can be really, really valuable. The US government does a lot of bad things, but one of the good things it does is publish an awful lot of the federal contracts that it signs. So almost in every case in which the federal government in the US pays for something with taxpayers' money, it declares it and puts their information online about the details of that contract. The EU does the same through this platform TED. The Freedom of Information Act, I mean, I could give a whole presentation on the Freedom of Information Act. It's an incredibly powerful tool in a great many countries around the world, but it's something that varies by country. Now, I would always be really happy to hear from people who are having difficulties with freedom of information, who want to draft a freedom of information response in their country. Yeah, I'd be delighted to hear from people if that's something they're interested in. LinkedIn is great for finding people, less good, for example, for finding photos and videos or video evidence, for example. But really, really good for tracking down people. It has a surprisingly powerful search function, I guess, because it's designed to be something that you look for very specific people, and that's something that open source researchers can really use and manipulate. And people, of course, social media helps you to find new people. Don't be afraid to get in touch with those people. The human sources can always be just as powerful as the open sources. This is USA Spending, for example. It's a really useful database. You can submit keywords. You can narrow down your contract requirements by year. And it can be a really powerful tool. Here's a couple of satellite image tools that you should look up. I'm sure you're familiar with Google Earth. Google Earth has this fantastic terrain view where, say I'm trying to geolocate this photo. It's from a city in Greece. One of the things that you would tend to do when you're geolocating, particularly from terrain like this, is to draw some lines across the image. And when we move into Google Earth, you can see that it's very clear that the same lines in the same position can be really easily seen. We can identify that this is, in fact, Thessaloniki, the city that we were looking for. So terrain view is a really, really fantastic tool. To go back to this image, actually, one of the other elements that would be helpful if I were looking to geolocate this image would be over on the right hand side here. On the left hand side of the image, we can see a sort of tower in the distance. Now, Wikimapia, which is a really powerful tool, a really helpful sort of open source mapping tool, has all of these categories. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this website. Has all of these categories which are user generated and user uploaded, and you can use those to search for particular objects. So let's have a look at this object over on the left hand side. We might say is some sort of mast. Maybe it's like a mobile phone aerial. Maybe it's a TV aerial. We would be able to look through Wikimappia's category hierarchy to see if anybody had identified this object and located it on the map. And in fact, we'll see that they have. You can see it down there over on the right hand side of the screen, an antenna tower. So this would be another tool in your toolkit for geolocating images. Incidentally, that image comes from the verification quizbot from QuizTime, which is a really, really fantastic Twitter channel. You should definitely get involved in this if you want to practice your geolocation skills. So we also have Google Street View, which I'm sure people are very familiar with, but has a really powerful historical ground level imagery function, which can be really helpful for chronolocating your images. You know where it is, but do you know when it was taken? And also, these are some free satellite image sites and also some paid satellite image sites. Satellite imagery is getting extremely expensive, and this is something which is causing concern in the open source community, but there are a lot of free satellite image sites still around that you can make use of. In terms of some other tools and tips, Google search operators are extremely useful things to use. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the basic search operators. It's things like file type, things like site, things like map, in URL, in text, all in text. These are really powerful operators which begin to just cut out the clutter from your Google searches. And what's really helpful about those is that you can almost do some sort of fishing expedition. So, for example, recently I did this search. So that's file type PDF. And the quote, "not for circulation." And what did I turn up? Well, you'll see the second entry on the list is from my own government, from the UK government. It's a draft contact tracing model for our COVID-19 response. So it's just a good example of, by doing some searches like this, coming up with innovative ways to use Google searches, you can find information that people didn't really want you to have. As it says here, this is from a few months ago now, but it was relatively contemporary when I found it. It was about a month old, and it was not for circulation. This is information that the government didn't want you to have, and it's quite clear what the applications of that could be then going forward. You could compare that to information which was published by the same institution and see what's different. Okay, reverse image searching is something that people are probably quite familiar with. All I would say is that we should use multiple search engines, multiple image search engines to explore the same image or to get at the same image. Every time you receive an image in the course of an investigation or some research, reverse image search it. Make sure that you know its provenance, make sure you know where it's come from and where it's been used on the internet first, if at all. If you feel like people might be trying to hide information from you, try flipping the image, try inverting the colors, try changing it, modifying it in certain ways that these different search engines will pick up. And it's important to use the different search engines because they turn up very different results. So for example, here is a hill in Edinburgh in Scotland. You'll see on the right here, you'll see on the right here is a set of results from Yandex. Yandex has exactly guessed where in the world this particular hill is, whereas on the left you'll see Google has rather disappointingly only told us that what's in the image is a hill. So it's really important to use multiple search engines because they will turn up different results. They're of course using different proprietary algorithms. Finally, in terms of metadata, there's three great tools there for you: InVid, EXIF tool, and photo forensics. These are really great tools for getting into the nuts and bolts of the image, what I think of as about the image rather than in the image information. So manipulated. Has anyone tried to crop anything out of it? Photo forensics tools are precisely the kind of thing that will help you answer that question. InVid is a really fantastic plugin which gives you what it calls contextual verification. When was this image shared on social media? And it has quite a lot of versatile options around that. And your EXIF data is the sort of data that your digital camera applies to an image in the background. And these EXIF tools and this how-to guide will tell you how to draw that information out of an image, so you can begin to see more about when it may have been taken and hopefully where it was taken to. You can also find information about the camera that it was taken on, and that can be really useful in certain contexts. Okay, I'm going to jump forward just a touch to think about. Okay, before we open up for questions, I just want to think about some of the sort of contextual issues that come up in open source research. First, thinking practically, and some of this will have a bearing on your on the live research exercise that we're about to do. So, I've shown you a few tools and talked you through sort of in principle how some of them work. The reason I didn't want to dive into them and to show you them in practice is because there is no one size fits all routine. There is no given process for an investigation or for activist research, as I'm sure you're aware. The process very much depends on the case. It depends on whether you're searching for new material, whether you want to find something specific, whether you want to verify information you already have, whether you're looking for a person, a location, or a document, or a change in location or use, whether you're looking for individuals, whether you're looking for restricted locations. When you're thinking about restricted locations, often it's important to think about what are the secondary sources for information. So the draft contact tracing model that I just showed is a good example of that, because that's restricted information that in principle, in general, would not be revealed. So we want to think about what are the secondary sources? Where would we learn about what the government is thinking about how to conduct contact tracing? You might find plausible secondary sources for that are what contracts is it purchasing? What contracts is it taking out with, let's say, artificial intelligence firms or bioengineering firms? There you might be able to learn something about the ways that it's thinking. When we think about image analysis specifically and geolocation and verification, it's important to think about images in three ways, or at least three ways. We can think about the image, which is to say metadata, EXIF data. Has it been manipulated? Has someone tried to conceal what this image really was? And also, what are the basic sort of factual things that we know about it? When could it not have been taken before? When, if the last date it could have been taken? Start to narrow down when the image was taken through its metadata rather than its content. Outside the image is also really important. When and where was an image shared? Who took it? Can you reach the person who took it? What do we know about who that person is? Often when we're trying to geolocate imagery, the easiest thing to do is to geolocate the person who says they took it. If they have a lot of social media posts about how much they love a particular restaurant in, say, Chicago or New York, then we know to look for the location of this image in one of those two cities rather than to say to begin in London or Manchester. In the image, of course, is the most important. Compare it to other sources, first of all, satellites, Google Street View. You can do things like shadow analysis to try and understand what time an image was taken. When we're thinking about what's in an image, there's always, and this is what I want you to take into your live research exercise, there's always way more in an image than you think there is. And one of the joys of doing this kind of work is thinking about the maximum information that you can extract from an image. A lot of that is storytelling and hypothesizing. But first of all, you can think, okay, where is it? When is it? How closely could I find out the date and time that this image was taken? Often you can only be very broad about that. You could say maybe it's in this half of the year. Maybe it was in this year rather than this year. But sometimes you can be very specific. What are some cultural and regional geographic identifiers in an image? When do certain background objects reveal a lot more about the location than you might have given them credit for? What unusual objects are in the image? How can you ID those objects? What could they be? What stories do those objects tell? What do they tell you about the circumstances and the environment that you're looking at? You think about the author of the image as well, the status and access and privileges that that author has. Are they allowed to be there? What does is a video being taken in a stable manner, or is it quite shakily taken? That might tell you about something. Might tell you something about the behavior of the author of that material. And of course, there will be more deep context, which is quite investigation specific, and we'll have an opportunity to think about some of that stuff in our research exercise. Finally, I want to open up by thinking about limits and biases of open source reporting, what we call OSINT. One of the most important things that we're grappling with at the moment is whose stories get found and investigated and reported. Smartphone use is extremely common throughout the world, but it's by no means ubiquitous. People who don't have smartphones, globally, phone ownership tends to skew male, and it tends to skew towards household leaders. It also skews toward a certain baseline measure of wealth. Internet connections are, of course, fundamental to being heard, and economic barriers and shutdowns have restricted people's internet access. So that, of course, affects the ability that we have to engage with their stories. Satellite image coverage is a very interesting one, because human rights monitors and open source investigators are now relying on a great deal on proprietary companies, right? We're relying on companies like Google or Planet. We're also relying on the US Geographical Survey and on NASA to give us information. And when we want to be interrogating state and corporate violence, it's obviously an element of concern for us that we have to rely on state and corporate means of information. And of course, you'll see that certain parts of satellite imagery, certain parts of Google Earth, for example, are pixelated, where there have been agreements between states and corporations about what information civil society deserves to know. Finally, what about violations that happen in the dark? This is something that we're really trying to work on accessing at the moment. Things like economic and slow violence, starvation, enforced drought, loss of income. These are some of the things that we're seeing in Yemen, for example, in the Saudi prosecuted war against Yemen. We want to think about gender-based violence and sexual violence in detention, where phones have been taken away. And a question which hangs over us all the time is, does the raw material of open source investigation, when we're analyzing airstrikes and we're analyzing military violence, does it skew towards what's visually spectacular, such as airstrikes? Okay, I think at that point, oh no, one more. So when we think about social media culture, it's obviously part of the fabric of what's created the situation for forensic architecture and other open source investigation teams to exist and to thrive. But we have to think about what that culture does for the information that it gives us, right? And how it conditions our response to that information and how it conditions audiences' responses to our work. OSINT material can be really powerful as what we call lead evidence. Again, the sort of the spectacular, the thing that makes you, that draws you into the investigation. We found this video of an airstrike. We found this video of a police shooting. Now we want to investigate the whole case. And we have to be careful there, because powerful visual material like that is capable of determining narratives and setting narratives before the whole picture has really emerged. Because almost like by definition, open source intelligence and open source investigation is never the whole story. What's available in the public domain is only that. Often it will be a great deal, but there is always information which is closed source, which individuals know or which states are keeping from us. We might think about whether the runaway success of some of the open source research methods that forensic architecture and others have used monopolizes our attention. Does it draw away from other research methods? And I'd be really interested to hear from some of the fellows about how some of the techniques that I'm proposing interact with your own experience of research and your own preferred tools and techniques. In what way are open source investigations expressive of power dynamics and access and privilege? And what responsibilities do we have as a result? What ethical requirements are there on sharing imagery, on amplifying imagery, and on locating it and proving certain things? Do we run the risk of exposing people to prosecution or other violence? Finally, there's a few resources for you at the bottom there. As I say, I will be sharing these slides with you. But when we think about representativeness, and we can think about the representation of various minorities in open source research and how that changes the field, this is a really live issue, and it's one that's really exciting for us at the moment. It's one I'd love to hear your perspectives on. Finally, at the bottom, there's a really wonderful piece written by our director, Professor A.L. Weissman, whose brainchild forensic architecture is in many ways. And I'd encourage you all to read that piece, because it tells you a great deal about how it is that we work. Okay, at that point, I'd be really interested to open up for some questions. Oh, I can't hear. There we are.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Zoom from Thailand. So I think okay, I have a few questions. So like number one, how do you before you were like investigative reporter, right? And now you're working on this forensics. So my question is, how do you think like an investigator? Like, how do you integrate it into your life?
Okay, that's a good question. I think moving from investigative reporting from quite a narrow field of journalism into what's now a very interdisciplinary and collaborative field has certainly shown me that investigations and investigative practice are extremely broad and can take on any number of forms. I think centrally, I would say that the investigative mindset is one of hypothesis and sort of cautious response to information. As we'll see in the live research exercise, what I really want to drive home is that often making progress in an investigation can be about storytelling. So if you have a piece of information, maybe you have two pieces of information, you can't see how they fit together. try and tell yourself the story of how they fit together, right? Speculate. I think a great deal, I remember a fantastic lecture I heard 6 or so years ago, in which we were told not to look for the facts which told the story, but to find the story which told the facts. So there is a story out there which connects your information. Try and find it, try and speculate on it, and then disprove that speculation, right? So if you have fact A and fact B and you can connect them in a number of ways, try one way. Say, perhaps this is what's going on. If that's what's going on, what would that mean for this piece of information? How would I find proof of it in another way? I think investigation as sort of self-storytelling and self-speculation is a really productive way for me to think about it across journalism, across activism, across academia and technical expertise. I hope that answers your question.
Hello, my name is June. Thank you for your presentation, which is a great learning implication for my criminal investigation as well. I'm a criminologist working in the UK. I've got some practical questions practical questions. So, how do you project when you are to project an image of a crime scene which has taken place for a long period of time, like for 10 years or 20 years, what kind of information and technologies you would prioritize to use, and especially when you are to establish a movement of vehicles. So I'm dealing with a crime scene that's made by paramilitaries in the north of Ireland. And if you are to trace a movement of vehicles that probably transport waste illegally, what kind of information would you prioritize to acquire, and where would you get that?
That's a good question. Okay, well, I mean, it's difficult for me to answer in specifics at this point, but I'd be really happy to speak to you at length over this by email and to try and give you some more specific pointers. It depends really. If you're talking about the movement of vehicles at a sort of industrial scale over regions, then it may be that you can find historical satellite imagery. Again, it depends on what sort of time we're talking about. If it's up to 10 years ago, you may be able to find quite detailed day-by-day satellite image material. If you're talking about within one incident, very much like for the Mark Duggan case, we knew certain start points and end points for vehicles, and then using architectural software, particularly Blender, which is an open source modeling software, which it's complicated, but it's something that there's a lot of learning resources around. It's something that you could feasibly teach yourself. Then it's possible to sort of animate average or approximate movement speeds, or if you know the start location and the end location. When you're building up information about a crime scene like that, that's where the information is no longer there, you have to understand, of course, that you're always operating within thresholds of assumptions, right? So you can give some average speeds, you can give some descriptions of likely or possible movements, but those always have to be, as is always the case in the language of forensics, they always have to be qualified by the certainty or the likelihood that you can ascribe to those. I'd be really happy for you to email me afterwards and we can talk about this in more detail, because it's quite difficult to give specific case-related answers without the information.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Ali. I'm from Ethiopia. My question might be a bit specific and technical, but just let me hear it from you. And my background is, my research are focused on photogrammetry, GIS, and urban development. And so I have experiences working with open source satellite images, like images from the USGS. And most of the problems that I face using those satellite images are focused on like because of the resolution of the image, and the images are, like, for example, the image from USGS are 30 meters resolution, so it is really hard to do some detailed analysis and works on those type of images. Yeah. So are there any techniques or methods that you know to improve the resolution so that we can get, like, I can do better analysis on those images? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, resolution in satellite images is one of the hardest sort of barriers that we face. I guess the simplest answer is no. There's not really anything we can do to improve the resolution of an image. There may be ways that if you have a higher resolution image of the same area, that you may be able to sort of overlay, and it might give you more clarity about what certain elements are, and you might be able to sort of move information laterally from one image to another. But yeah, I mean, your best bet would be to try and find higher resolution imagery through paid sources, I suspect. But that's obviously quite restrictive in many ways. If you know any students, it's possible to get student access to certain satellite image resources. But the resolution barrier in satellite imagery is, of course, absolutely sort of fatal to many of our investigative avenues. It can be an incredibly difficult thing to get around. Let me have a think about, maybe I can provide you with some more detailed resources on where to get satellite images of a higher resolution. Sorry, I'm not able to give you a great answer on that. It's a hard problem.
Hi, my name is Jin Young from Korea. So as a curator, I'm curious about the way of presenting or representing the work of forensic architecture. In fact, I saw the work of forensic architecture for the first time in MMCA Korea. You remember the exhibition? Maybe the name of the exhibition was Indigenous Data?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think is the pros and cons of presenting your work in the context of museum? Because, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a question we get asked a lot, and I think it's a good one, because it can sometimes seem a little counterintuitive that we use our work in cultural spaces and in galleries, and of course there are implications to the presentation of work in cultural forums. Simple things like how can something be art and evidence at the same time is a question that we get a lot. We've been in some strange situations where, in relation to the same case, art galleries and cultural institutions, art exhibitions will say, well, this shouldn't be here because this is evidentiary material, while court cases and parliamentary inquiries will say, this shouldn't be here because this is artistic material. So in a way, sometimes we fall between two gaps like that, and that could be problematic for us, or we can think of it as a strength, and we can think that we are being provided with an opportunity to show people that artistic material, aesthetic sensibility doesn't have to lack an evidentiary quality. I think practically cultural institutions have been really valuable for us because they take us into spaces where a huge amount of people can see our work. Sometimes hundreds of thousands of people can see our work at these cultural institutions, and that can, we've found in many cases, that can sort of act to unblock other routes to political or legal engagement with our work. So in Germany, we exhibited at the Documenta Art Fair in 2017. And as a result of that work being seen at that exhibition by state politicians, by local politicians, we were invited to present in parliamentary inquiries, and we sort of re-entered the political and legal discourse, having used a cultural institution to magnify and amplify our work. But as I said at the top, I think that there's sort of two strands to forensic architecture's work. On the one hand, we want to challenge and expose human rights violations, and on the other, we want to talk about the process of how those violations are communicated in the first place and how we communicate our response to them. And the question that you've asked there gets at the second thing there, which is to say, how do we innovate in ways to present information? As I showed in the Duggan case, we'll be taking virtual reality into a cultural institution to allow people a new engagement with this question of whether an officer could have seen what he said he saw. So we find it really productive in general, I think. We, of course, have to be careful of some potential pitfalls, but I think most of those pitfalls are the result of a sort of a limited understanding of the possibilities of aesthetic work. It's an opportunity for us to prove a new paradigm, essentially, that aesthetics and evidence don't have to be in opposition to one another. And in fact, the word aesthetics is very interesting to think about in that context, because the opposite of aesthetics is anesthetics, right? Which means no feeling, which means to not be sensitive of the world. An anesthetic is, of course, what you're given before you have surgery so that you can't feel. So in that case, aesthetics is the opposite of unfeeling, right? It's sensing, it's recording. So when we talk about material aesthetics and material witnessing, we mean that aesthetics is the way of reading the marks left in the world, whether it's on buildings, whether it's on the earth, by the events that we're investigating. So in that sense, aesthetics, we feel, has an incredibly powerful evidentiary dimension, because it's precisely the way of understanding and reading the marks that violence leaves on the world, the marks that violence leaves on the body, as we saw in the Duggan case, and then representing and displaying those marks, modeling and recreating those marks in a cultural institution. I wonder whether we should, let's perhaps take one more question and then we'll move to the live exercise.
Hello, Bob. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm from Uzbekistan, Shohrukh, PhD graduate, recent. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
So first is, do you think artificial intelligence or big data or these kind of new trendy technologies can help you, can help for digital forensic specialists in the future or now maybe? And my second question is, how did you have in your experience, like public or any other or government organizations require you to validate your research data or validate your research project? Because as a researcher, we know that validity of the data and clarity is important, right? Yeah.
Of course, great questions. Okay, I'll try and answer both of them relatively quickly. So I think, of course, machine learning and artificial intelligence is a conceptual field that we have to understand and get to grips with across all of society pretty quickly. And I don't believe that we'll necessarily do that healthily or in the right way. I'm sure that we're seeing a lot of examples in the UK of the government using algorithmic processes extremely poorly and harming a lot of people in the process. There are certain limited things that I think machine learning could be really helpful for in digital forensics. We've seen some use of machine learning and computer vision in satellite image analysis. We've also pioneered ourselves the use of object detection, computer vision algorithms. So in searching through open source imagery, for example, tear gas, to find tear gas grenades or indeed tear gas clouds. So there are certain basic functions like that I think machine learning could be really useful for. And again, if you'd like to contact me afterwards, I could send you some specific examples of those projects. But again, that sort of information always requires human oversight. we would never expect the machine learning processes to be intelligent enough to resolve things or to make conclusions or findings on their own. And that really comes to your second question, right? How do we validate and how do we underwrite the importance of the work that we do or the importance of our findings? And I know that you're a PhD student, and I think that's relevant to the answer. We are a university institution. We're part of the University of London, part of Goldsmiths College, and that gives us access to a huge amount of expertise, of course, but also security and legitimacy. Our work is closely peer reviewed, it's ethics reviewed. There are stringent academic processes that we have to go through, that we have to present sort of support for and evidence for in relation to each of our cases. So we do a lot of that work ourselves, and we want to make sure that the data that we use is valid, of course. But it also depends on where we're presenting this work, right? I think one of forensic architecture's strengths, one of the strengths we aim for, is that we try to, we want to be able to talk in multiple different forums in different ways. So the way that we talk to a media organization is different to the way that we talk to an artistic institution, is different to the way we talk to a courtroom. And your question really comes to the courtroom there, right? How do we learn to talk the language of courtrooms, and how do we learn to secure our findings against the challenges of governments and lawyers? And that's a process that we're still engaged in. Of course, we have support networks throughout sort of legal NGOs, and it's also something that we've demonstrated a capacity to do already. We have been in a number of court cases. We presented to our work in the UN, the European Court of Human Rights. So it's difficult to give a single answer because it really depends on the case and it really depends on the forum. But it's certainly something that we're always aware of and engaging with, that question. Okay, I'd like to, so thank you very much for all those questions. They were really, really interesting. And I mean, if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards with any questions, the organizers have my email address and I'm very happy for them to share it with you. So I want to move on to a live research exercise. What I want to do here is give you an opportunity to look at some of the sort of raw material that we've been given for a previous investigation and some of the basic facts about that investigation, and to expand outwards from the images, to look at these images, to sit with them for some time, to do some basic internet research. You're not going to have very long, only about 40 minutes, but also to think about exercising your investigative mindset, right? One of the questions the fellow from Thailand asked me about that investigative mindset, right? And that's exactly how I've designed this exercise. You're going to see a small amount of information, and I want you to think about where you could find more, what avenues it points you towards. That can start, as I said, with storytelling. What's going on in the images? What guesses could you make about other information, and how could you test those guesses? Sketch out some possible answers. What does this mean, what you're seeing in the image? Maybe there's more than one thing it could mean. So let's try and find what those possibilities are and see how we would go about answering them. Let's get into the head of the people in the images. Who are they? What do they do? How do they live? What kind of behaviors do you expect from them? And what's unusual and unexpected against that? How could you go about confirming any of these unexpected things? So I want you to use internet sources as well as image analysis techniques. I want you to be thinking about your investigative mindset. And don't lose sight of the fact that you don't have a great deal of time. I'm interested in the questions that you're asking as much as I'm interested in the answers that you find, because it's precisely about learning to think on think on this kind of investigative track, right? So you might want to say, well, given more time, what I would try to find is this, and I would look for it here. It's about pathways to information rather than the answers. I will be here. I don't know if there's a way that any questions can be quickly communicated to me if they come up, perhaps not, but I'll leave that to the organizers. Now, can I just confirm that everybody has the document that I sent round? Maybe one of the organizers can confirm this for me. I see some laptops there. Perhaps people would like to share if they're doing internet research together. somebody there able to confirm for me from the team?
Yes, I did.
Hiya. Everybody has that document, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. And so if everyone is in a position to begin doing some internet research on those, then you'll see that there are 6 specific questions and 5 more general questions. As I say, just dive into each of them and see what we can find, and we'll come back together at say about 8:40. Oh, well, more like 3:40 with you. Anyway, 20 to the hour. We'll come back in 40 minutes. Great, thank you.
Bob, it's 4:20 in Korea, so 4 o'clock in Korea. So what time are you?
4 o'clock. Okay, so we're coming back at 20 to 5.
Okay, 4:25, right?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, no. We'll have 40 minutes from now.
Okay, so
I think-
4:40, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. So, I hope everyone got on well with that. It looked like people were pretty involved, so thank you. So I think let's start with a couple of these specific questions, and I'm going to maybe just run through some of the answers to them on the presentation, and then we'll open up, and hopefully there are some microphones, and we can have a conversation about some of the later questions. So let's start with this question of geolocation. Always a great place to start whenever you have an image. Where was it taken? When was it taken? So can we locate each of these 7 images? I'm sure you guys did a really good job of locating them. It's quite difficult to check each of them in turn, of course. So let's start with the first image of a man stood on a track. Now, I hope everyone noticed in the back corner of the image here, on the right-hand side, we have the aircraft hangars that we can see further down in the sort of southwest corner of the base. So that helps us to locate this image. We also have this large fence. We can see a sort of kink in the fence, a sort of slight corner, and we can see a gate, and that should lead us to the assumption that this photo was taken approximately where the number 1 is now. Okay. Now this is where it starts to get quite interesting. So this photo, well, again, perhaps you will have noticed in the very top back of this image, you can see the hangars. This helps us again. We've got quite a large space before the hangars. You can see some trees in the distance. So I'll give you the location. This one was up in this very top corner. But this is where we need to start thinking about what's really interesting about these questions, right? Because I'm sure that you noticed the most interesting detail of this photo from a base in northern Cameroon, which is that we seem to have white people. They seem to be dressed like we might imagine Americans on their sort of in a sort of relaxed dress might be dressed. So we begin to ask this question: well, what are they doing there? And I just want to turn it over to you guys and say, is there anything else about this image that jumps out at you? What did you think when you saw this image? What details jumped out at you? Anybody want to grab the microphone and jump in, or there'll be plenty more time to do so later on. I mean, I hope what really, somebody going for it there? I mean, from my perspective, what jumps out when we saw these photos is what's going on with those satellite images and those satellite dishes in the top right corner of the image. Right? What do we think those could be for? Well, that's going to be something that we're going to need to work out, right? I also think, well, what are these guys wearing? And they look pretty casual. Let's suppose they are from America, or maybe they're from Europe. I don't know. Who wears a t-shirt and shorts in a military base? Well, not soldiers, right? I mean, if you're soldiers and you're in a military base, you have a uniform and you have a certain code of dress You certainly don't get caught walking around in trainers. So who are these guys? Well, they're not military then, perhaps they're contractors. So we begin to build up a little bit of a picture. Now there's some American contractors or European contractors, they're being paid to be there. What is it that they're providing that the army can't do itself? Or maybe if they're being sent from America or Europe, why aren't American or European soldiers being sent there? Why is it outsourced like that? Perhaps you have some thoughts on that. Feel free to jump in, anyone at any time. Move to the next image, number 3. Now, I hope you all figured that one is in many ways a similar image to this one, to the image before. So it's also taken around the same point. But there's some fascinating details in this image, right? Did anybody have anything that they wanted to pull out of this image? I think there's a couple of really interesting things in here. If anybody wants to jump in with some comments, then do. Otherwise, I'm going to keep sharing my thoughts with you. So when I see a photo like this, I see, okay, again, what are people wearing? We've got some people dressed like they've just come from playing sports, maybe, or maybe this is just like a kind of athletic, like leisure kind of style that they like to wear. You've also got one guy in uniform there, right? So that tells you something about a relationship of hierarchy, perhaps. You'd suspect that the guy in the uniform, he's got his shoulder pads, he's in charge there, right? Now you've also in the foreground, again, you've got this white guy, he seems like a kind of older guy. What could his relationship be, and why does he get to talk to the senior local military in the area? You know, it's not a question that we can answer immediately, but you think now about where they are. We've got these satellite dishes. What could these satellite dishes be for? Is it connected to the fact that there's senior conversations going on here? Are we in some kind of control area? And if we are, well, why is that control area so far from the rest of the base? You know, if you look at the satellite image, this is some technology that's been placed as far as possible away from the rest of the base. And they've built a new area of the base, and then they've put it at the very top corner. Why? Again, if anyone's got an idea, if anyone's got some thoughts on that, just grab the mic and let me know. Now, there's bonus points on offer if anyone worked out what that device is that's at the back of the photo, because that took us a very, very long time to work out. But there's an easier detail before that. What's on this shipping container? Did anyone work out what this shipping container tells us?
Bob,
Yes.
Bob, yeah.
Yes, go.
Bob, sorry. Actually, these photos were very wisely chosen, and they have hidden. It was difficult for us to find out where these are located, because these kind of red containers are in the base itself. But I assume that after your explanation why they built separately from the central base, because they don't want to, I mean, and the Cameroon military officers, they don't want contractors to see their activities, or to be involved in their data. Or maybe there might be some espionage or data leakage from the Cameroon side. That's why they, how to say, divided with wall, and then put them to another corner, like very far corner. This was my
I think you're really onto something there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I think it's a good assumption, right? There's something about that distance. Either they're protecting something from the Cameroonians, or the Cameroonians are protecting something from the Americans. Now, at the top of that document that I shared with you, it said that we'd received a tip-off about this place from Amnesty International, right? So I think there's an additional layer to this. Maybe there's some sort of data that's being kept apart, but also, perhaps the Cameroonians know that there are things going on in this base. You know, there's harm being caused, there's violence carried out in this base that they don't want the US to see, or that it's safer for them that the US doesn't see. Again, maybe this is something we can explore in some of the later questions. Okay, let's take a look at another photo. Sorry, before we do that, so the final detail in here is what's on this cargo container, right? Does anyone recognize that logo? Did anyone manage to track down what that logo is for?
Yeah, hi. Sorry
Yes.
to intervene. We suspected that the container suggests the Israeli involvement in this space.
Great, well done. Zim is a very famous and global Israeli company that transports materials. So there's obviously, they've sent some materials here, right? And perhaps you were able to find in your internet research more information that could connect Israelis to the Cameroonian military. There's a long and interesting relationship there. So that's great. Every time you see a logo, find out what it is. Those are some of the best clues you can get. Okay, so let's move on to another photo. This one, perhaps you worked out that this, I mean, the giveaway detail I have here, I think, is this long white strip which runs down the middle of the photo, and we can see that that is echoed with a sort of blue element in the middle of it. You can see that that's echoed right down at the bottom of the image there, near to the entrance to the base. So perhaps this is some kind of parade ground or something, right? It's down here. Now, another interesting photo. Now, perhaps we worked out that this one is taken in quite a similar place. There are elements of this photo which are the same. You can see the white stone markings on the right-hand side of this image, which seem to be the same as the white stone markings on the right-hand side of this image. So perhaps we can guess that this photo was taken somewhere around here in this large open area where they seem to be playing football. Now, this tells us more about these people, right? They obviously don't just come here only for military operations. This is somewhere they live. This is somewhere they train, somewhere that they're allowed some downtime, where they do exercise. So we know that probably the people that live here are quite comfortable with their environment. It's a place that they consider home in some respect. Okay, this helicopter, where is the helicopter? Well, in the modern day satellite image that we have here, we can see that there are circles on the ground with H's. We can see that there are large vehicle hangars. So we'd probably safely assume that the photo is taken somewhere around the hangars, right? But there is something problematic about this image because there's something which doesn't match up between the current ground level image and the current satellite image. I wonder if anyone noticed that this image, for example, does not have the bright white wall, the brand new wall that we saw in the very first image. So this satellite image was taken in April 2017. We moved back in time to 17th of May 2016, which is a previous image that we got from Google Earth. We can see there's no H and circle markings on the ground, and we can see that there's no wall. So that tells us that this photo was taken at the latest sometime before April 2017, right? So then we can begin to think, okay, well, where did they get this helicopter from? Maybe there's some information about that. Did anyone find information perhaps about the sales of helicopters to Cameroon? Because there is some information out there about this particular model of helicopter and who sold that to them. And then we can begin to match up information that we find in the public domain with information that we find on satellite images. So let's have a quick think about these satellite images while we're here. We're taking them from Google Earth. Google Earth is an absolutely wonderful tool, and it has, as you'll see highlighted in blue at the top of the screen here, it has a history function. Maybe you're familiar with this. I mean, it's something that's been central to the growth of open source investigation. So let's move through time with this, this set of images. And again, when things jump out at you, please feel free, put your hand up, grab the microphone, and tell me something that that you're speculating here. Tell me a story about what you see. So we see when we move to May 2016, there's been a lot of development in this base, right? We've gone from a very small, lightly fortified base. All of a sudden, look how many walls there are, how many trenches there are around this base. So it stands to reason that somebody's concerned that this base is going to be attacked, right? Now, if we look in the literature, we'll see that around 2015-16, Boko Haram, the terrorist group that the military in Cameroon are engaging with from this base, was really in the ascendancy. You can see the base has been fortified. You can see that it's been solidified. Now, what about those contracts that we saw? Those contracts that we saw that suggested that there was American military involvement, right? It's after that time that we see this sort of growth, right? We see, where are they? We see this growth over time. So it seems like the sort of acceleration in the size of the base and the connection of the American military may have gone hand in hand. We can see now the wall has arrived. We can see there's been more material arriving in the top, in this sort of what we might call the American corner that we see here. We can see that that growth continues. Now we're in 2018, very recent. You can see that more material arriving. 2019, we can see more expansion. So this is a base which is really, really growing. What you can also see is we've now got paved roads, right, which we didn't have back in 2017. Now, why do you pave roads in a base? What do paved roads allow you to do? They allow you to drive heavier vehicles, right? Bigger vehicles. So perhaps that's another sign that there's an expansion in the sort of military material that's coming through the space. And that might be something that we can connect up to wider research. And then, yes, finally, in May 2019, we see, what do we think this is in the top corner? Has anyone any idea? In the very top of the image, the new growth area. Well, I think from looking at the nature of what you see there from the air, this is a parade ground. So maybe this base has become quite a sort of central headquarters. It now has a formal parade ground. Maybe that means more soldiers are coming through it. They need more space to do training and practice. It's also an interesting example of when you see people on satellite images. As some of you will be familiar, as you're familiar with questions of resolution in satellite images, you don't usually see people on satellite images because they're smaller than a pixel. Here we have enough human bodies in a place that the satellite image can read at least some of them. So there we are seeing some soldiers on parade. Okay, final image that I want to place is this one. Now, did anyone get where this was? Because it's pretty tricky. It took us a while. Now, this is a good example of where a photograph gives you very little context. We've got trees in a building. Well, we're seeing loads of trees in a building. But we've got a road, we've got trees on one side of a road and then a building on the other. We've also got this object, which is some kind of pylon, right? Now, it's very difficult to see that from the air because it's just a sort of a pinpoint, except that it casts a shadow. So to find this, we had to go looking for a shadow that could be a tower in other images. Now, here is where we found it. There you see we have a tower, a sort of a shadow cast, which is a long, thin shadow, suggests a long, thin object. You note that we also have, if we come back, we have the road, we have the trees on one side of the road, and we have the buildings on the other. So we think that this photo was taken somewhere around here. But that's not the most interesting thing about this photo, right? Here we have the crux of the story, because here we have, well, what do we have? What do people think about this photo? What does it say to them? I think there's a whole story in this photo. To me, this photo says a training relationship, right? A relationship of experience to inexperience, a relationship of a very well-equipped military that's providing information and equipment to another military. Did anybody find the contracts that relate to this equipment? On the USA Spending website, there are contracts which talk about the sale of night vision equipment to Cameroon. And lo and behold, through the Facebook photos that we found from within this base, we found that exact equipment, that very same piece of equipment that the US contracts talk about. We see it now being deployed. We see it deployed by what looked like quite experienced US military personnel, handed off to what looked frankly like quite inexperienced Cameroonian military personnel. You know, they're wearing trainers. They are, some of them look slightly detached from the situation. They don't look entirely professional. They look like they might be quite young, might early in their military careers. So we begin to see now that on the one hand, equipment and training is being provided. On the other hand, there's some sort of satellite equipment being provided, as we saw in the northwestern corner of the base, some information which needs to be kept apart. So there's a relationship of togetherness, but there's also an understanding that certain things need to be kept apart. And we think that's really, really interesting. Okay, so I now want to open it back up to you. There's a number of questions here, and general questions and also specific questions. I'd just like any of you to suggest to me an answer to one of the questions, what one of the questions made you think, any observations that you had about the material, any further questions. Let's hear what you have to think. Just need someone to go first.
Hi again. So obviously we have a lot of documents, information, you know, how do you kind of organize this thing? And because it's like, you can start with anything. What's normally do you look for the first, and how do you organize this data?
It's a very good question. And it's one with to which the answer depends on the material itself, I think. In this case, okay, we'll talk through the process that we had with Amnesty International. They said we need to try and stop what's going on here. There's torture happening, there's detention and killing happening here, and we want to try and stop it. So we thought, well, with these rumors of there being Americans involved, or there rumors of being European partners to the Cameroonian military, perhaps the best way to sort of leverage the information we have to stop what's happening there is to try to embarrass the US military in some way, right? To make statements that to say, did the US know that there was torture going on here? Now we have all of this information which says that there are US soldiers in the area. They're familiar with the Cameroonian local soldiers. They seem to have access to quite a lot of the base. There's also, as one of the fellows pointed out, there is also a sort of a relationship of separation, so which seems to suggest that, or could suggest that, somebody knows that there's something going on that the Americans shouldn't necessarily see. So how can we organize the information that we have around? So I was answering the question about where to start, where to organize all this material, right? And I understand that it could be a sort of an intimidating amount of material to work with. I think there's a number of things that you should think about doing first of all. First is to write down key identifiers, like this Israeli logo, like this object, like names, key dates and locations, and then try and expand your research outwards, right? I don't know who tried running some sort of relatively complex Google searches on the name Salak on this base. What you might have found, for example, was that in 2016, so a long time before some of the material that we're working with here, so 2018, 2019, what you'll see is that the US government used a human rights report, a sort of draft executive summary for itself, during which it describes that there have been documented cases of torture at the Salak military base, as well as in other locations. So what does this tell us? Well, this is information which is relatively easy to find through a Google search. And this tells us that the US government already knew that there have been allegations of torture and violence at these bases against civilians. So that's really important information, right? Because when we begin to think about these questions of why certain elements of the base are sort of kept so distinct from one another, then we start to think, well, maybe that's connected to the fact that the US government already knew that there were these allegations of torture. So to go back to Sharuk's observation that perhaps there was some required distance, perhaps the required distance was also requested by the US side, right? Because they knew that there were things that it would be better for them to be as far away from as possible. Now, these are not things that it's not allegations that it's very easy to stand up, but this is precisely what I mean about the investigative mindset as a way of telling stories for yourself, being kind of speculative. Okay, so we have these pieces of information. What are different ways that they could fit together? Because we know that they do fit together somehow, right? We know that there is a reality out there that we need to understand in which all of these pieces of information fit. All of the jigsaw pieces add up to something. So why don't we try and guess what they are? And then we can see if that fits with other information as it comes. In terms of the object that I asked you to identify in image, suppose it was in image 3, was it? Back here, yeah. So I'm going to assume from the radio silence that nobody did find out what that object was, and that's quite understandable if you didn't. It took us quite a lot of research to get there, but when we did, we found that this is in fact the object. Can you see this on my screen? Yes, I suppose you can. This is a drone catcher. Amazing piece of equipment. You'll see that here it's in its state and here in its unfolded state. You can see a drone hanging from it. So what we have there is a piece of equipment deploying and retrieving a certain kind of unmanned aerial drone, a sort of surveillance drone. So another layer of information gets added to this puzzle. We now know that this little corner of the base, at the very northwest of the base, is used for operating drones. Now, why do you fly drones? Well, they give you aerial information, right? They're a sort of a command and control device. They give you information you otherwise wouldn't have had, and then you can pass that on to someone. So we begin to build up this picture of US contractors flying drones, passing information to senior military members of the local Cameroonian military, who then presumably pass that information on to their soldiers and begin to direct operations on the basis of it. So we have a very clear example of the kind of what we call proxy warfare, engaging in warfare against terrorist groups, designated terrorist groups, by using and supplying and equipping the local military, rather than, as the US is often less keen to do, risking the lives of its own soldiers. So here we see a concrete example of the way that warfare is fought in the 21st century by the global North powers. They equip young local soldiers, they direct them, they give them military support, they ensure that they're well supplied by corporate partners, in this case Israel and elsewhere, and then they leave those local partners to put their lives on the line fighting the wars that the US are interested in fighting. Again, I'm gonna just for the last time throw it back out there to you to see if there's any other questions or observations that you had about some of this material. I hope I've given you something of an idea of where you begin to dive in. It's a really organic process. You know, there is no right answer. There is no master process to analyzing this information. But you can begin to follow threads. You can begin to draw things out. And as I say, what brings it together is your capacity to give yourself a story, to give a storyline that threads some of this information together, and then to test that storyline. Now we have around 20. We'll go a little bit over past since I lost a few minutes there to my connection. So let's say we have around 25 minutes left. What I'd like you to do in that time is our project design exercise. Now, what's going to happen in this exercise is we're going to pick a topic area. Perhaps I understand that you may have already been worked out into groups. So we're going to pick a topic area. I'll leave you guys to decide which topic area you'd like to think on. Some suggested areas, perhaps COVID-19 state responses to COVID-19 in any country that interests you or is relevant to your research. You might want to look at the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States and some of the police violence and perhaps the far-right responses to that violence. We've obviously seen some really dramatic escalations of that in recent days. You might want to pick a sort of an international incident, something like the warehouse explosion in Beirut recently in earlier this month. But you can also pick another topic area in your group. If you can make a case for why that topic area is interesting and relevant to your group, then I'm very happy to hear it. What I want you to do is get together in a small group, propose a research question. Perhaps it's a research question that already connects to some of your research. Perhaps within your group, you can find a sort of a middle ground or merge some research questions that you're already thinking of. And think about it like, what's a small question from which we can learn about wider issues? What's a sort of an incident question or a narrow question which tells you something about a larger experience or a larger political or social condition? Keep your question fairly clear and well defined, and then discuss some of these following questions. And these are the kind of questions that will organize some of the open source phases of our research at Forensic Architecture. So what kind of information might be available? Where would you find it if that information was available? What research tools and techniques could you use to acquire and to analyze that information? What kind of institutions, either specific named institutions, if this is a topic area that's familiar with you, or something more general, would you collaborate with? Who would you collaborate with, both on drawing in information, whether that's sort of situated knowledge, whether that's community experience, or maybe it's something more specialized, maybe it's academia expertise. And who would you collaborate with in terms of presentation as well? Which institutions, when you work with and on behalf of them, would you aim to amplify their situated experience, their lived experience? I think it's very important to assume that we're doing this work in order to uplift and work on behalf of institutions and organizations and individuals and communities that need allies in a certain fight. And what modes of presentation would you employ? Where and how would you aim to show your research findings? What do you think would be amenable forums for your potential findings and conclusions? Is this something that you would present cartographically? Is it something that you would present through some kind of interactive medium, through a platform, a web platform? Or perhaps it's an exhibition, perhaps it's something in a show, perhaps it's non-visual, perhaps it's a written report or an article or a media engagement, even a series of engagements with media. So what I want to see at the end of this is that you've proposed a research question, you've articulated it, and then devised, in line with some of the things that we've been talking about today, what's there, how could you find it, what problems do you expect, and how to solve them and how to circumvent them. Who would you collaborate with and how would you share this material? So I think if we can just dive back into our groups for maybe 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes and sketch these out, then we'll have 10 minutes just to feed back on them at the end and any further thoughts before we wrap up. Okay, if the team could just confirm for me that that's okay, and I'll come back in 10 or 15 minutes. Is that okay? Hello?
Okay.
Okay, great. Cool, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing what you come up with. Okay, if you'd like to all come back together to share some of these ideas before we finish, that'd be fantastic. I'm really interested to know a little bit about the ideas that you have and whether these are existing ideas or new, and to see if through answering some of these questions you can reflect a little bit on what we've talked about today and how some of forensic architecture's methods and practical ideas might reflect and might inform the work that you want to do. So we can keep this very general. I'm just very happy to hear from anybody about your project designs, your design ideas, whether you have questions, whether you have observations or reflections. I'll give you a moment to come back together.
Would you repeat it again, please?
Sure. Okay, so if we'd all like to come back together sometime soon, then we can reflect on our project design ideas. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your research proposals and your research questions, and then we can together maybe feedback on how some of forensic architecture's methods might be able to inform your ideas or provide new avenues for research.
they are too focused on their work right now.
That's okay with me.
Hello, Bob.
Hello.
Okay,
Yes.
so we. Where is? Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, so we took a case about the killing of George Floyd and the BLM movement, the Black
great.
Lives Matters movement. And the main research questions are: what are the main causes of the killing? Studying the main causes of the killing, why he got
Interesting.
killed, and also what are the psychological stress this killing has created on the colored and non-colored people, and what happened to the police officers after the killing and how they killed him. So these are the main research questions we want to investigate. And the sources of the information are, we believe we're going to have two big source of information. The first one is informal type of sources, and these sources can be witnesses that were there at the place when this killing happened, and social media videos and pictures are also will be also investigated. And for the formal type of documents, we will try to get some documents from the public officials and the police, and the results will be published on newspaper articles and on broadcast media. It can be TV or radio.
Sure. Okay, great.
And also, people who participated in the BLM movement also has to get informed about this. Do you have anything to add? Okay, so that's it.
Okay, great. I think there are some really good ideas here. I'm going to offer some of my thoughts quite quickly, as I know we have a few groups to get around. This first question, right, how did he die, and what you said, what are the causes of his death? Now, I think in one sense, we know what are the causes of his death, right? There was a police officer who knelt on his neck and choked him. But the causes of his death go so much further back than that. We can think about the causes of his death in a wider sociological way. We can think, well, what are the sort of learned behaviors and patterns of behavior and patterns of interaction between white police officers and black civilians that lead to these kind of interactions, and where can we see how those behaviors have been codified, how they've been justified, and I think that also speaks to your question: what happened to the officers? Because in a sense, the killing of George Floyd was extremely remarkable in that it reinvigorated this movement, generated this energy, this activist energy, which has moved around the whole world. But in another sense, it's a very common thing, right? It's quite unremarkable that a police officer kills a black man in the US. It's lamentably extremely common. So when we think about what happens to the officer after something like that, well, what always happens to the officers in this case? How do they continue to be protected from the consequences of this? And there's again something wider there. So I think it's a fantastic research focus, because in the killing of George Floyd and in the moments of what happened during his death, you see huge questions, which, as you rightly point out, need to be addressed in partnership with BLM activists and with the communities and individuals who have intimate experience of this violence. But I think it's a great research focus. Would anyone else like to offer some thoughts or their own project design?
Yeah, so our research, I guess, topic was going to be investigating the actions of the National Guard, federal law enforcement officers in Portland during the Black Lives Matter protests. So there were, I guess, like allegations of law enforcement showing up in like unmarked vans and not identifying themselves as law enforcement, and then basically like taking people away for interrogation.
Right.
I guess there are quite a few video clips of people being like tossed into vans, and then I guess like first person accounts of how they were, like one person said they had their like beanie like pulled over their face, and then they were like taken to a courthouse and yada yada yada.
Sure.
So Bob, for source of data, we would like to use Twitter and other social media to download as much as videos and images, news, and also we would like to use police database. If we can find the faces of the policemen, and we can compare the
great idea.
Faces of the protesters or that assumed people, like with the T-shirt, because we heard that there is rumors that they used similar T-shirts to identify themselves. So not to touch themselves, like not to attack each other. So how to?
I see. Okay.
So and then our scope is Portland, and then we would like to also cooperate with NGOs in the USA and Black Lives Matter movement, leaders, because they also know about this issue, and they might know more information about background, like from their network. And then Human Rights Watch maybe can help us also, with and then Jung will want to add.
I don't know if they'd be allowed to do this, but I know like the city government in Portland were really frustrated at the actions of the federal agents.
Definitely.
Because there were things that the federal agents were allowed to do that like the local city enforcement like weren't allowed to do. And then I guess like all of the vans were unmarked. If there was a way to like track like where they went or like where they were rented or where they're stored, that might help.
That's a really interesting avenue. I like that. Because vehicles, there is a lot of data available about vehicles that's often public. Vehicles are also great because they show up in satellite imagery, so perhaps there may be a point where you can see where these depots are that the vehicles are coming from if you can match the route, the aerial profile of a vehicle to its sort of ground level profile. I think this is a really great idea, and it's something that forensic architecture has been looking at itself, actually. I think maybe one of the, in a way, it's a classic open source investigation, right? As you said, you go to Twitter, you find videos that show these things, then you need to show consistency of behavior between these videos. Maybe you can say that's the same van that was used on this night in this place, and it was used on this night in a different place. So you can start to tell that story, right, of where and when this event unfolded. In terms of your presentation, I think, something that's, when I hear about like a series of incidents like that happened over different nights in different places, I think, okay, people need to know the spread of this, right? They need to look at a map and they need to see these things on there. So, maybe you've got one point that happened on a Monday in this location, you've got another one on a Wednesday in this location, another one on a Thursday in this location. And you can begin to tell a narrative, right, of how this activity, this essentially illegal activity by unnamed federal law enforcement agents is sort of moves around the city. And maybe you want to overlay that with information about protest activity. Are they following the main thrust of protest activity in Portland? Are they going to the really busy areas to try and make a statement, to try and pick people off? Or are they going to find sort of smaller areas of protest. Maybe they're just finding individuals and just grabbing them, and maybe that begins to tell you a little bit about their motivations for doing this in the first place. You know, because why would a law enforcement officer, why would the federal agents be doing this, right? Are they just trying to intimidate? This is something that you might be suggested that that's their motivation if they're doing this in a very public place, if they're doing this in front of lots of protesters. Maybe they're trying to gain informants. Maybe they're trying to pressurize people. Maybe they're trying to wait until they see someone on their own who's doing something criminal or potentially criminal. And maybe they're trying to get that person because they can use some leverage on them. So I would think about this information in spatial terms. You know, think about the map over which it happened, because I think an investigation like this is really, really amenable to that sort of approach. In terms of NGOs, you're right. I mean, I think what we're finding when we try and investigate in the US, and particularly police violence, is it's an incredibly complex field. Because you have the federal agencies, you have hundreds of state agencies. I mean, I think there's something like 16,000 police forces in the US. It's a really broken up system. It's not clear who has jurisdiction initially in lots of different places. So what you need to help you unpick that is someone like the National Lawyers Guild, or you know, other organizations of lawyers of legal experience that are familiar with protests, familiar with police violence, who can help you pick through some of these questions and like hone down your research question. So I think it's a great idea, and there's a lot in that.
Bob,
is there anybody else? Yes.
Bob, sorry, can I add some addition? So maybe we can use GPS trackers of the vehicles when they park it to the police station and on then, or if
you can get that data, that would be great.
Yeah, no, just my thought. Yeah.
It's sort of it's out there, right? But how do we get it? I mean, and you said also police records and police databases now.
Yeah, once they come to the work, when they left from work, from their neighbors, maybe we can see.
So one of the things that's good about the U.S. government, again, there's not very many things, is that their freedom of information laws are very, very strong. So you can request an awful lot of very specific information from police forces, from city councils. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And this goes to anybody who's working on international cases that involve US companies with US that operate in US jurisdiction, maybe US aid agencies, or that in some way come into contact with the US federal system. Think about what kind of information may be held by the US government that might shine a light, because you can often get that information, and you don't have to be a US citizen. Any human in the world is able to ask the US government for quite a lot of information, and they have to work hard to tell you why they won't give it to you. Okay, maybe we've time for one more group, if anyone else would like to contribute, but also I'd be very happy just to hear anyone's reflections on anything more broadly. Please just dive in.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Yunsuk in Korea, and your theme is why the Korean company cause ecological destruction in some Asia country, and also case by the India illegal gas rig by LG Chems, case of the 2020 May 7, and the information is the use report and settlement images and police picture on the ground, and local interview or victims interview, or environmental agency report or NGO agency report in this issue. And the key point is to extract key detail about some report and compare it and change over the before and after by watch the Google Earth, as you know, and direct evidence, find the direct evidence, and also the conclusion is the demonstration and announce this kind of view and make an academic report to it, and lastly on site with predictor. Is it?
Perpetrator.
Perpetrator, like the name of company, LG Chems, the first call, like climate villain, and it is all.
Okay, great, thank you. I think it's a really good idea. It's a really ideas around ecocide and environmental violence, I think, are really good places to pursue open source research because there is a surprising amount of information available. Also, what you can avoid when you're thinking about satellite images and trying to tell stories of ecocide and environmental violence, you can avoid the problems that one of your colleagues mentioned previously about low resolution, because you can tend to still tell stories about environmental violence with larger resolution satellite imagery, because what you're talking about is violence over a larger area and over a longer period of time. So there's a number of reasons that ecocide and other environmental violence is really amenable to open source research. One of the techniques that we've commonly used is something called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI. Now this is a way of using open source satellite image data, overlaying images from one time and another time, and showing the loss in vegetation over that time through changes in photosynthetic response or in light response, which is indicating photosynthetic material. Perhaps this is a technique that's already familiar to some of you, but it's been really, really valuable to us. And I think something that you got at in that project outline, which is great, is connecting that remote analysis to the stories of victims and indigenous communities or local victims who experience that ongoing environmental violence. Something I think forensic architecture has really pioneered is the simultaneous exploration of the satellite-led scientific analysis with the human history and the lived experience of what that violence has entailed, where that violence has come from, and how there have been political and social conditions behind it, and then how that feeds back into the political and social conditions and environment that it occurs in. Okay, I think that's a really interesting proposition, and as I say, I think it's really amenable. Now, by way of wrapping up, if anyone has any final thoughts or contributions or questions, I'd be really delighted to hear them. From my own perspective, I'd only say thank you for being such enthusiastic contributors, for your thoughtful contributions. And I'll say it again, it can be difficult to really answer your questions in full in a format like this, but I'm very, very happy to hear from any of you by email, to continue the conversation, to expand on any of the things that I've said, or to discuss any of the tools that I haven't had chance to go into fully, and to hear from you and to hear about your research interests. I'd be delighted to.
Okay, thank you, Bob, and let's give a big applause for him.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
And I think it's 9:30 in London right now, and it's bright comparing to the beginning of the seminar. And I reckon that the seminar was very intriguing, and thank you for participation. And is it okay to share your email address to the fellows?
Yes, please do. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, and have a nice breakfast, and bye.
I will. Goodbye.
Bye.
Take care.